You've really got to learn to make the applause last till the speaker gets up. I feel relatively kind of humble speaking here this evening, given the other people who are on the billing this evening, although knowing that Toby Young and Rachel Johnson are coming next week means I no longer feel underqualified. They're just like me, essentially. Enough of the niceties. What I'm going to talk about is one of the episodes effectively in the book that I've written about a history of conspiracy theories. This is somebody who's incredibly worried about me going on too long after even a minute here. A book about the modern history of conspiracy theories, and the second chapter in the book is devoted to one particular conspiracy theory, and it's that I want to talk about, because in a way it is the kind of mother lode of all major world conspiracy theories, and it continues to this day. And the episode that I'm talking about is about a book, a pamphlet that began to circulate in Europe and around the world in the year 1919. That was the year in which, translated into several different languages, in varying sizes, sometimes as a small pamphlet on its own, sometimes as a small book collated together with other passages and so on. It was translated into French, into Spanish, into German, into Russian. It made the translation across the Atlantic to America. There was a British edition published by Aaron Spottiswoode as a private edition, though Aaron Spottiswoode at that time actually bore the stamp of publishers to His Majesty the King, and so on. It went through the whole of South America in Portuguese and Spanish editions. There was a Japanese edition. You could find it in Shanghai. You could find it in Australia. There were varying titles that this pamphlet would be given. It might be called, in America, The International Jew. It might be called The Rabbi's Tale and Other Stories. But generally, at the centre of it was a chapter, an episode, a claim to being a transcript, almost verbatim transcript of a particular meeting, and this would be entitled The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Usually, in an introduction to this particular work, the author would tell you the provenance of this particular tale. The author would say something like, this document was a secret record of a secret meeting held at the same time as the First World Congress, Zionist Congress in Basel in 1893, I think it was. At the same time as that meeting, these people, who were the leading Jews in the world, got together to have a discussion. And this pamphlet constitutes a record of that discussion. After they'd held this discussion, the stenographer completed the record. Several copies were then made in conditions of utmost secrecy, but somehow or other, and from there the stories would differ, the record was intercepted and copied either by agents of the Tsar, or else at the behest of an aristocratic lady who was having an improbable affair with one of the elders of Zion and managed to steal it while during the aftermath of one of their trysts in a Basel hotel or somewhere similar, was given over to the security forces to copy, and this was the copy. There would be a number of such stories. It was stolen out of somebody's safe and so on, and thereby came eventually to the person who now presented it for the population of France or Spain or Argentina or Japan. This pamphlet was incredibly successful, just enormously successful. So what did it say? What it said was, we, elders of Zion, we the leading members of the Jewish community, throughout the world, meeting as a kind of international brotherhood, have taken a decision about how we intend to take over the entire government of the whole world. This was the small, minor ambition which was claimed on behalf of these people. And it was to be done, according to this record, in several particular ways, but all ending up with one thing in mind, with one objective in mind. What this body would do is it would take over or gradually infiltrate all the political parties. The monarchist political parties, the socialist political parties, the Bolshevik political parties, the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, the Liberals, and so on. It would take over and infiltrate the trades unions, the employers' organisations, the organisations of finance capital, the armament manufacturers, and so on. It would take over all the newspapers. Here I just want to give you a quote from the English edition of 1919. And it gives you an idea of the language they would use. All journals published by us will be of the most opposite in appearance, tendencies, and opinions, thereby creating confidence in us and bringing over to us our quite unsuspicious opponents, who will thus fall into our trap and be rendered harmless. All our newspapers will be of all possible complexions: aristocratic, republican, revolutionary, even anarchical. Like the Indian pagan god Vishnu, they will have 100 hands, and in each shall beat the pulse of a different intellectual tendency. And why would you do this? Well, what you would do it for is in order to create the maximum amount of dissension, discord. You would stir up discord. You would promote revolution as a consequence of this discord, and revolution would lead to war. Revolution and war would, between them, create the ultimate cataclysm in European civilization. And once that cataclysm had happened, the peoples of the world, looking round for clear leadership, looking out of the abyss for clear leadership, their gaze would fall on none other than the leading Jews of the world, and they would, of course, all say, "Please lead us, O Jews." And this was the theory. What is remarkable about this pamphlet is that it wasn't laughed out of court by the populations of these countries, as we would obviously laugh it out now. Quite the opposite, actually. Let me take, for example, the editorial in The Times, the paper I now work for. Not quite sure I would have worked for it in 1920. The Times said about the protocols, this document purporting to be about the Jewish world takeover, are they a forgery? If so, whence comes the uncanny note of prophecy, a prophecy in parts fulfilled, in parts far gone in the way of fulfillment? And then it asked this: have we been struggling these tragic years, these would be the years of the First World War, to blow up and extirpate the secret organisation of German world dominion, only to find beneath it another more dangerous, because more secret? Have we, by straining every fibre of our national body, escaped a Pax Germanica, only to fall into a Pax Judaica? This is the editorial of The Times, written by the then editor of The Times, who thought it entirely possible that actually the entire business, the uncanny note of prophecy, refers to the First World War, that the business of the First World War somehow or other had been concocted by a Jewish conspiracy. Large number of other newspapers in Britain, the Morning Post and also the Weekly Spectator, followed suit. So in the case of the Spectator, one might think not much change there over the years. I couldn't help reflecting upon this when I read a couple of years ago a long article in the Spectator about the Islamic takeover of Europe, which included a great shadow of a crescent and star over Europe, and a gigantic mosque looming out of the British countryside, and thought how appropriate this would be. But this was obviously of a slightly different complexion. In other countries, it was taken far more seriously than in England. It informed the young Adolf Hitler and his acolytes and the major young Nazis, particularly actually in the period just before and just after the Nazi Party was formed, as they walked around a kind of variety of weird and wonderful organisations like the Thule Society in various parts of Germany. This pamphlet would be circulating as the answer to why Germany had failed, as to why Germany had been defeated and had met the cataclysm that it had. But Germany wasn't the only country. In America, a very surprising champion was found for the protocols in the shape of Henry Ford, the most successful industrialist and innovator of his era, who in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, in the early 20s, championed the notion of the Jewish conspiracy and the Jewish fight for supremacy in that kind of way of which psychoanalysts call violent innocence, which is to say, I'm just asking the question, when in fact, actually, you're seeking in the biggest possible way to answer the question. He said there was this Jewish question which needed to be solved, and article after article in his newspaper would talk about the Jewish takeover of various aspects of life, including in one rather remarkable passage how Irving Berlin had actually destroyed Native American good music in order to replace it with Jewish music, possibly one of the most successful cultural takeovers in human history, certainly since the Norman Conquest. And his paper then published, under the auspices, a series of pamphlets called The International Jew, which he funded to be placed into other countries. So, this pamphlet is well on the move. Now, you might ask yourself why, in the first instance, this seemed at all an attractive proposition. Why is it that people would believe such a fairly obviously ludicrous story as that all their woes had somehow been caused by this group of people who were a relatively small group of people no matter where you went, with the possible exception of some parts of Poland and some parts of Ukraine, which was the various Jewish communities. And for that, in a way, you need to take yourself back into the Europe of 1919, but also maybe back into the Europe of 1914. In 1914, the Europeans went to war, most of them, in the belief that their own particular side would not only win the war, but would win relatively quickly. The phrase, "it will be over by Christmas," was not an empty phrase for people at that stage. They actually did tend to believe that the martial glory of their own particular side would lead to victory. There were, of course, many people who said not, who said it would be catastrophic, but nevertheless, this was the mood. There is a photograph somewhere of a crowd in Vienna in 1914 celebrating the onset of the war against Serbia, which is the first of the mobilizations that takes place in that war. And if you look at a detail in that photograph, there, waving his hat in the air in celebration of the declaration of war, is the young Adolf Hitler. It's a kind of rather it's a remarkable photograph. But such scenes were also seen in Britain, they were seen in France, and they were seen in other countries too. In other words, there was a fairly firm belief that there would be a victory. Nobody predicted that what they would then see would be 4 years of the most terrible industrial war. 1/4 of the men in France between the ages of 18 and 30 were killed in the First World War. 1/4. As many, and if not more, were wounded, and we're going to be talking, I think, a little bit later about what some of the consequences of that can be. But it wasn't only the human scale. You could measure that certainly on the victors' side, the number of Britons that were killed, even 230,000 Americans, though they entered the war in 1917, were either maimed or killed. What had also happened was that the old order, the order that had existed in 1914, had collapsed. It had collapsed completely. The Austro-Hungarian Empire no longer existed. It had split up into several different countries: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, a small Hungary itself, a small rump Austria, and so on. Germany no longer had an emperor and had lost quite a lot of its land. Emperor Wilhelm was the last Kaiser of Germany. The Tsar had disappeared in the Russian Revolution of October 19, in fact, in the Revolution of February 1917, and then Bolshevism had taken over in October 1917. The Sultan of Turkey had not much longer left after the end of the First World War to go. Now, try and imagine the scale of that as a trauma for the peoples of Europe when you think it was unexpected. And who was to blame? Well, in one sense, of course, the governments were to blame and the militarists were to blame and so on. But in another sense, in most of these countries, the people were to blame. They had, after all, in significant numbers, supported the call for war, bankrolled their governments into it, refused on the whole to protest against the creation of such a war, and allowed themselves to be drawn into it, the kind of celebration that we're talking about. It is not a very, very big part, it seems to me, of human nature, either now or then, to say to people, you know who's to blame for all this? Me. It is not still one of our most kind of fundamental, when I look at my children even, one of the things they tend not to do, and haven't done since they were youngest, is admit immediately when it's their fault rather than their sisters or brothers or siblings and so on. I think we can say this is kind of fairly, unless you've been through a lot of therapy, people tend not to admit their mistakes, or unless they actually are completely forced to. So in a way, there is a desire to displace the person who's guilty. Now let's go back to 1921. 1921, there is the Times correspondent, and this is the story which restores the Times' reputation. And what happens for the Times in 1921 is one of the reasons I can feel easy about working for them now. That was a joke. Is that the Times correspondent in Constantinople, Philip Graves, has a meeting with a Russian emigre. And the Russian emigre, an ex-aristocrat, Russian Orthodox, says to Philip Graves, I was given a whole series of books, he said, sold a whole series of books by a former agent of the Russian secret police. And amongst them, he said, is this little book about 5.5 inches by 4.5 inches, no cover on it, called Dialogues Between Machiavelli and Montesquieu in Hell, kind of snappy little thing, which was published as a satire about Napoleon III in Brussels in about 1864. And Philip Graves looked at this book and examined the various parts of the book. He found, amongst other things, this chapter. In this chapter, I shall count, says Machiavelli in this book, on devoted journals in each party. I shall have an aristocratic one in the aristocratic party, a republican one in the republican party, a revolutionary one in the revolutionary party, an anarchist one, if necessary, in the anarchist party. Like the god Vishnu, my press will have 100 arms, each hand of which will feel the nuances of public opinion. In other words, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were a complete forgery from beginning to end, but believed. Let me draw this to a conclusion by saying this. The consequences of the belief in that document were absolutely catastrophic for a major minority in Europe. Still widely believed by people, widely believed in Germany, still today believed in places like Iran. Every time there's a Hollywood blockbuster, on Iranian television, somebody will stand up, somebody will wheel onto Iranian television a professor of media studies at Tehran or some other university, and he will examine something like Meet the Fockers, and he will say, yes, you see what's going on here? What's going on here is an attempt to portray the Jew, the Ben Stiller character, in a sympathetic light so people will feel sympathetic with them. It is all, will say this academic, in accordance with what was laid down in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That is Tehran in the year 2010, not Berlin in the year 1921. Thank you.